You know what I think's causing the most frustration these days? I think it's that in our current situation, we don't have anything or anyone to really blame or to really point at and go, that's the enemy. This is not a physical being. This is not a physical threat. It's a health threat. And when there's nothing that you can see and point at and, paint a mustache on and say that's the villain, it starts to make you feel really, really confined with your fear and your anger. On top of that, all of our handy war substitutes, sports, are null and void. So you can't even work out your frustrations there. Sometimes in life, you just need to know who the good guy is, who the bad guy is, and just let them go. With that feeling and that reassurance that good is going to triumph over evil. So in this time, I find that one way to do that is it's time to reach for that unsung hero, the action movie. And in lieu of good action movies, sometimes you need to go with a passable action movie. And that brings us to today's topic, 1992's Passenger 57. This one holds a bizarre place in the pantheon of late 80s, early 90s action films, which in my opinion was the best time for action movies. They were kind of at their most action-y. The late 80s, early 90s is what brought us our Lethal Weapons, our Die Hards, a whole shit ton of Schwarzenegger films. So the action movie was kind of at its peak. And towards the end of the 80s, we got Die Hard, which kind of redefined the action genre into the wrong place, wrong time scenario, as opposed to having a badass like Schwarzenegger who would just go out and kill everybody because, that's what he does. You now had a guy who was just trying to do their job or was trying to go on a vacation or whatever, and craziness happens and they have to take care of it because they're the best person suited for the job. And out of that, we got what I would consider the Elemental trilogy. You had Die Hard, which of course takes place in a skyscraper on land. Later in 1992, you would get Under Siege with Steven Seagal, which of course took place on a boat, so there is the water. And to round out the trilogy, you have Passenger 57 with Wesley Snipes taking on a plane hijacker. I don't think I really need to go into the plot for this too much. It's fairly self-explanatory. Again, if you've seen Die Hard, you kind of get this premise. Wesley Snipes is a head of airline security who is on his way to a new job when, lo and behold, he happens to be on the same plane as the FBI, who are escorting the world's most dangerous plane hijacker to trial. Of course, the hijacker's people break him out, they take over the plane, and the only person who can save the day is Wesley Snipes. Now, normally I say is this movie perfect segment for the end? But I feel like I kind of have to talk about it here at the beginning because of the films I've talked about so far on Forgotten Gems, I feel this is the weakest so far. Again, a lot of these movies are not, cinematic masterpieces, so they all have flaws. But this one seems to be the most flawed so far. Part of the problem is that, number one, unlike a boat or a skyscraper, they discover the major problem with doing one of these type things on an airplane, and that is there are not a lot of places to go on an airplane. There's not a lot of places to hold interesting fight scenes. There is not a lot of places for the character to stop and rest and catch their breath and have, one-on-one scenes. So to fix that, they have to, stop the movie dead in the middle for the plane to land, for both Wesley Snipes and the villain played by Bruce Payne to get off the plane, have a scuffle, get them both back on the plane for the finale. And it stops the film dead. I also have to say that in terms of villainy and bad guys, these ones in this film definitely feel the most generic. All right, Hans Gruber and his band in Die Hard all had personalities. They were interesting to look at. Under Siege, you had three. You had Tommy Lee Jones, Gary Busey, and Cole Meany, along with all of their various henchmen. So you had a nice combination there. Here, the villains are just kind of the generic direct-to-video bad guys, Pardon me. Just dry throat, don't worry, I'm not coming down with anything. So you don't feel like the threat is really that threatening. Bruce Payne as our main villain, Charles Rain, is interesting. He's not bad. I think he is actually a really interesting villain, and he seems to be having a lot of fun with it. They play him as just this very icy, very cold, very, very evil character. His gimmick is that nothing seems to faze him. He's in a fight with Wesley Snipes, and his face, the expression never changes. It's always this cold stare. Interesting way to go. Problem is, you're not going to match Alan Rickman, Tommy Lee Jones, Gary Busey, and Cole Meany for manic energy and charisma. And they brought those villains a lot of charisma. Most people love Die Hard because of Alan Rickman. So the setup is not great. The villains aren't great. So it definitely feels like the most direct-to-video of all of these films, all of those action films of that time. So why then do I still think this film is worth a watch and still deserves a place on the list of films for forgotten gems? Well, first of all, it is a spectacularly tacky time capsule. Again, we're looking at the late 80s going into the early 90s, 92. So the 90s hadn't really blossomed into their own thing yet. They were still leeching off the 80s a lot. So in terms of the fashion, the pop culture references, the technology, it is just amazing to look at and just go, oh man, the fucking 80s and 90s. They use those big brick cell phones. When Wesley Snipes has to call for help on the plane, he has to use the old time phone on the plane. You put your credit card in and chuck it down and all that. They still kind of use something like that, really. So I guess that's not that out of it. The hairstyles. One of the first villains, the first henchman that Wesley Snipes kills, is this dude with this fucking long Jerry curl. It's a white guy. With this long, curly hair, fro kind of thing. Very 80s bodybuilder look. And I'm just like, oh my fucking God. There's one dude, an extra on the plane, an African-American guy, and he's got the Kid and Play haircut. The hair up to here and perfectly squared off. It's like, oh my God. So the film has it has a lot of fun value for late 80s, early 90s cheese, which is something I love. But also working in the film's favor, first of all, Wesley Snipes. I think Wesley Snipes was a very underrated action hero. In terms of action films, what we tend to associate Snipes with is either the Blade movies, where he's, I think, playing it a little too much. He's pushing it too far. And as the villain in Demolition Man, which is awesome. And he is, again, like a lot of 80s, a lot of early 90s villains, just chewing that scenery. But here he's playing a much more normal character. But what you get with Wesley Snipes is you get someone who has the acting chops, because he is a very good actor, to pull off the everyman kind of feel of the character, but he's athletic enough, clearly trained in martial arts, so he's much smoother in his action scenes than a lot of them. Like, again, looking at his two peers there, Bruce Willis in Die Hard, the fight scenes are a lot of just round cowboy punches, just a lot of this. Steven Seagal was a martial artist, but he was not an actor. And he's a much bigger, bulkier type guy. Wesley Snipes is much trimmer, much thinner, and therefore his movements are a lot silkier, a lot smoother, a lot cleaner. Again, we're not quite into the hyper stylized and over choreographed fight scenes that we get into in the 2000s, but his stuff is fancy enough to distinguish him as a unique presence, and smooth enough that it still looks super cool. When he's beating up on these guys and he's kicking them, roundhouse kicks, karate punching them and shit, it looks like nothing else at the time. And the film just has some classic moments. I found it very funny to me that this film didn't spawn any sequels. That should be a hint right there, to be part of the problem. Everything got sequels back then. There was an Under Siege 2, Speed 2. They've done 5 Die Hards. They did, 4 Lethal Weapons? There is no Passenger 57 Part 2. And yet, what's bizarre is I remember at the time, people were quoting this, and it was really hyped, or at least certain moments were really hyped. The moment where the old lady sitting next to Wesley Snipes on the plane thinks he's Arsenio Hall and is going, "Oh, I love your show. Woo, woo, woo." For those younger viewers who have no idea what the fuck I'm talking about. And of course, its ultimate catchphrase, Die Hard had yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker. But I think Passenger 57 had a amazing catchphrase, and it was spouted everywhere. It's still repeated today. People still reference it today. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you got to watch it, because I'm not going to do it justice, because I am not anywhere near as cool as Wesley Snipes. When he's on, of course, they're doing the obligatory scene where you got to be on the phone with the villain, and you're, throwing barbs back and forth. And, he says to the villain, he says, "Let me ask you a question. You ever play roulette?" "On occasion." "Let me give you a word of advice." Camera zooms in. "Always bet on black." Great fucking line. And I remember that line being thrown around a lot. And people still reference it. So, it's not a perfect movie. We've already gone into that in great detail. But I think Snipes is a unique action presence. And this movie does make you a little sad he didn't play the hero a few more times in his career, aside from Blade. And I think that they do have some fun when they are on the plane with the environment that they have. The final fight scene with Wesley Snipes and Bruce Payne makes good use of the environment and makes it therefore more unique than, again, just kind of some random punch 'em up that you'd see in other films. The stuff when they land in the middle of the movie isn't all terrible. Wesley Snipes, it lands in Louisiana, so of course Wesley Snipes comes up against the hillbilly cops. And he and the guy playing the sheriff have a funny chemistry back and forth. Tom Sizemore, making his second appearance on Drive Home Reviews, is Wesley Snipes, his Al, basically his buddy. He's pretty good in this. He and Wesley Snipes have some good interaction. Again, it's a little dry and it's not as smooth as some of the other ones, but unique action presence in Wesley Snipes, some interesting fight scenes, and a villain that, again, not as charismatic as some of his brethren, but a cold and cool kind of villain in his own right. So, not a lot to say about Passenger 57, but I do think it deserves another look, if for no other reason than it is an excellent time capsule of early 90s action films and what those were looking like at the time. So if you're an action movie buff and you haven't seen this one or haven't picked it up in a while, give it a watch. I doubt it's going to blow your mind, but it's entertaining enough. And in these days, sometimes you just need something to be entertaining enough. So, there you are for Passenger 57. So, I hope everyone is doing well. Hope everyone is staying happy and healthy. Keep calm, carry on, and as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.